They told us Proverbs was wisdom, quiet, simple, harmless. But what if those words were never meant to comfort? What if they were meant to warn? Behind every proverb hides a law of heaven, a secret only the wise dared to speak, and the proud always ignored. What if I told you that the Book of Proverbs, sitting innocently in your Bible, contains some of the most mysterious and controversial secrets ever written? What if the wisdom literature you thought was just practical advice for daily living actually conceals hidden knowledge that early church fathers almost banned from Scripture entirely? Tonight, we're diving into the forbidden depths of biblical wisdom to uncover truths that have been deliberately obscured for centuries. The Rabbinical College of the first century nearly excluded Proverbs from the biblical canon, not because it lacked divine inspiration, but because its contradictions and hidden meanings were too dangerous for ordinary believers to encounter. What they discovered within these ancient texts was so profound, so theologically challenging, that it threatened the very foundations of how people understood God, wisdom, and reality itself. You see, the Bible itself admits that wisdom is communicated through what it calls dark sayings. Proverbs chapter 1, verse 6, specifically mentions these dark sayings that require interpretation. The Hebrew word used here literally means puzzle or riddle, suggesting that the surface-level meaning of these ancient proverbs was never their ultimate purpose. Scholars describe these teachings as wisdom disguised in figurative and enigmatic forms, like deep wells from which hidden instruction must be carefully drawn. This isn't speculation or fringe theology. This is what the text explicitly tells us about itself. When people read the Old Testament literally, they fundamentally misunderstand it because it operates through symbols, parables, allegories, and yes, dark sayings that conceal deeper truths beneath their practical surface. What you're about to discover will challenge everything you thought you knew about biblical wisdom and reveal why certain religious authorities have worked so hard to keep these secrets buried. But before we go any further, let me warn you about something. Once you see these hidden patterns, once you understand what's really encoded within Proverbs, you can never read it the same way again. The comfortable, sanitized version of biblical wisdom that most people accept will no longer satisfy you. You'll begin to see connections, symbols, and meanings that transform not just how you read Proverbs, but how you understand the entire structure of biblical revelation. The first dark secret hiding in plain sight within Proverbs is one of the most controversial theological puzzles in all of Scripture. Throughout this ancient wisdom literature, wisdom itself is personified as a woman. Not just any woman, but a divine feminine figure who claims to have been present at the creation of the world. This isn't metaphorical language or poetic imagery. This is systematic theological presentation of a feminine divine being who operates alongside God in the fundamental ordering of reality. Think about how shocking this should be to anyone familiar with the supposedly patriarchal nature of ancient Hebrew culture. Why would wisdom be portrayed as female in a society that supposedly diminished feminine spiritual authority? The answer reveals one of the most carefully hidden aspects of ancient Hebrew religious practice. Current biblical scholarship suggests that woman wisdom represents a remnant of what they call the missing Hebrew goddess, potentially connected to the Queen of Heaven mentioned in Jeremiah and the goddess Asherah, referenced in ancient inscriptions. This isn't fringe scholarship or feminist interpretation. This is mainstream biblical academic consensus, acknowledging that Hebrew religion may have originally included feminine divine figures that were later suppressed or transformed to fit monotheistic frameworks. The woman wisdom passages in Proverbs chapter 8 present some of the most theologically challenging content in the entire Bible. Here, wisdom declares that she was beside God like a master worker during creation, leading some early Jewish sects to believe in an actual divine being known as woman wisdom, possibly understood as God's wife or divine consort. The implications of this revelation extend far beyond theological curiosity. If Hebrew wisdom literature originally included or transformed goddess traditions into acceptable monotheistic forms, then our understanding of biblical religion requires fundamental revision. The Egyptian connection makes this even more intriguing. Ancient Egypt had a goddess named Maat who embodied wisdom, and throughout the ancient Near East, wherever we find wisdom personified, we discover divine feminine figures. This suggests that Hebrew wisdom literature didn't emerge in isolation, but participated in sophisticated international traditions of goddess worship and feminine divine wisdom. But the mystery deepens when you realize that this feminine personification of wisdom isn't just historical artifact. It's active throughout Proverbs, teaching, calling, offering instruction, and warning against the consequences of rejecting her guidance. She speaks with divine authority, claims eternal existence, and promises life to those who follow her ways. This isn't passive symbolism. This is a dynamic divine personality who operates within the text as a distinct spiritual entity. The second dark secret involves what scholars call the strange woman, or adulterous woman who appears throughout Proverbs as wisdom's opposite. On the surface, these passages seem like straightforward warnings against sexual immorality. But the deeper spiritual meaning reveals something far more sinister and prophetically significant. The strange woman represents how spiritual forces use worldly systems to draw people away from righteousness and divine truth. This symbolic interpretation connects the harlot imagery in Proverbs to the larger biblical theme of spiritual adultery, where unfaithfulness to God is consistently portrayed through sexual metaphors. But here's where it gets truly fascinating and disturbing. The connection between Proverbs' harlot imagery and the whore of Babylon in Revelation reveals a prophetic dimension that spans the entire biblical narrative. The warnings about the seductive woman in Proverbs weren't just about personal morality. They were preparing readers to understand later revelations about systematic spiritual corruption and deceptive worldly powers. The narrative of the whore of Babylon follows the same patterns as the personification of corrupt cities and nations, as women who commit spiritual prostitution in Hebrew prophetic literature. This suggests that the wisdom literature was functioning as prophetic preparation, teaching readers to recognize spiritual deception disguised as attractive worldly wisdom. The strange woman in Proverbs represents the same seductive force that would later manifest as the great deception of the end times. Think about what this means for how we read these ancient texts. Every warning about the adulterous woman becomes a lesson in spiritual discernment. Every description of her seductive tactics becomes instruction for recognizing systematic deception in religious, political, and cultural systems. The practical advice about avoiding immoral relationships transforms into sophisticated training for spiritual warfare against deceptive principalities and powers. The third dark secret hiding within Proverbs involves the deliberate contradictions that nearly prevented the book from being included in the biblical canon. The rabbinical college almost excluded Proverbs because it contains obvious contradictions that seem to undermine its authority as divine wisdom. The most famous example appears in chapter 26, where verse 4 says, "Not to answer a fool according to his folly," while verse 5 immediately commands the opposite, telling readers to answer a fool according to his folly. These contradictory proverbs are deliberately placed together. There's no way the ancient editors failed to notice they contradict each other. This suggests intentional paradoxes designed to provoke deeper contemplation and reveal hidden levels of meaning. The contradictions aren't mistakes or editorial oversights. They're sophisticated teaching tools that force readers beyond surface-level interpretation into more complex understanding of wisdom's nature. But why would divine wisdom present itself through contradiction and paradox? Because reality itself operates through apparent contradictions that require spiritual discernment to navigate. The same action can be wise or foolish depending on circumstances, timing, motivation, and spiritual condition. True wisdom isn't found in rigid rules, but in developing the spiritual sensitivity to know when and how to apply different principles in different situations. This paradoxical approach to wisdom reflects something profound about the nature of divine truth. God's ways are not our ways, and divine logic often appears contradictory to human reasoning. The deliberate contradictions in Proverbs train readers to think beyond simple cause and effect relationships into more complex understanding of how spiritual principles operate in practical reality. The fourth dark secret involves Solomon himself and the hidden aspects of his legendary wisdom. While popular interpretation presents Solomon as the perfect wise king, ancient texts reveal knowledge about magic, demons, and the invocation of spiritual entities associated with his reign. King Solomon's hidden side involved studying forbidden things and delving into astrology, esotericism, and the invocation of spirit beings, leading him to deviate from orthodox religious teachings. This isn't mere historical gossip or unfounded speculation. Ancient sources describe sophisticated systems of spiritual practice associated with Solomon's court that went far beyond conventional religious worship. The rituals associated with Solomon's keys and seals involve complex interactions with spiritual realms that traditional interpretation either ignores or actively suppresses. These practices suggest that Solomon's wisdom included esoteric knowledge about spiritual hierarchies, angelic and demonic forces, and methods for influencing invisible realities. But here's where the interpretation becomes even more intriguing and controversial. Some scholars suggest that the demons associated with Solomon represent negative aspects of human personality and consciousness, rather than external spiritual entities. The rituals described in various texts function as psychological tools for self-understanding and spiritual development, rather than methods for summoning literal demons. This psychological interpretation transforms the apparent occult elements into sophisticated ancient psychology disguised as spiritual practice. The implications of this understanding are staggering. If Solomon's wisdom included advanced knowledge of human psychology, consciousness manipulation, and spiritual dynamics, then the wisdom literature he inspired contains layers of meaning that operate on psychological, spiritual, and practical levels simultaneously. Every proverb about human behavior becomes instruction in understanding hidden motivations, unconscious patterns, and the invisible forces that shape human decision-making. This connects to another disturbing aspect of Solomon's story that most people never consider. Despite his legendary wisdom, Solomon's reign ended in spiritual apostasy and political disaster. The same person who wrote or inspired much of Proverbs ultimately fell into the very traps that his wisdom literature warns against. This suggests that intellectual knowledge of wisdom principles, no matter how profound, isn't sufficient for spiritual success without proper application and spiritual discernment. The fifth dark secret involves the international context of ancient wisdom literature and how Proverbs fits into broader networks of esoteric knowledge transmission. Solomon's wisdom wasn't developed in isolation, but participated in sophisticated international traditions of philosophical and spiritual instruction. Monarchs came from distant lands to learn from Solomon's incomparable sagacity, suggesting that ancient wisdom operated through international networks of initiated teachers and secret schools of instruction. The connection between biblical wisdom and Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and other ancient wisdom traditions reveals how Proverbs participated in what scholars call international wisdom, with Israel's wisdom literature possibly developed in royal courts and houses of learning, that maintained contact with similar institutions throughout the ancient world. This international context suggests that the hidden meanings in Proverbs were part of sophisticated, ancient educational systems that operated across cultural and national boundaries. But this raises uncomfortable questions about the uniqueness and divine inspiration of biblical wisdom. If Proverbs shares common ground with international wisdom traditions, what makes it distinctly Hebrew or divinely inspired? The answer may lie not in its uniqueness, but in how it transforms and redirects universal wisdom principles toward distinctly Hebrew theological and spiritual purposes. The same wisdom that other cultures used for various purposes becomes, in Hebrew hands, instruction for covenant relationship with the God of Israel. What we've uncovered so far represents only the beginning of the hidden mysteries concealed within Proverbs. The personification of wisdom as a divine feminine figure, the prophetic significance of the strange woman imagery, the deliberate contradictions that force deeper contemplation, Solomon's connection to esoteric practices, and the international networks of ancient wisdom transmission all point toward layers of meaning that most readers never encounter. But these revelations raise even more disturbing questions about what else might be hidden within these ancient texts, and why certain religious authorities have worked so hard to keep these secrets buried beneath surface-level interpretation. The sixth dark secret lurking within Proverbs involves the coded language of spiritual alchemy and transformation that runs throughout the text like a hidden river beneath the surface. When you begin to understand the symbolic framework operating within these ancient teachings, you discover that much of what appears to be practical advice about daily living actually describes sophisticated processes of consciousness, transformation, and spiritual refinement. Consider how frequently Proverbs discusses the refining of silver and gold, the testing of metals in fire, and the purification processes that separate precious materials from dross. These aren't casual metaphors thrown in for poetic effect. They're systematic descriptions of spiritual processes using the language of metallurgy and alchemy that would have been immediately recognizable to ancient initiates but completely opaque to casual readers. The alchemical interpretation reveals that Proverbs functions as an instruction manual for what medieval mystics would later call the Great Work, the transformation of base human nature into refined spiritual gold. Every teaching about patience, discipline, and moral development becomes a step in this hidden curriculum of consciousness elevation. The fool represents unregenerate humanity trapped in base metal consciousness, while the wise person embodies the refined gold of spiritual maturity. But this alchemical dimension extends far beyond individual transformation into cosmic and prophetic significance. The same processes that refine individual consciousness also operate on collective levels, transforming nations, cultures, and entire historical epochs. The testing and refining that Proverbs describes isn't just personal development. It's the mechanism through which divine purposes unfold through human history, separating truth from deception, authentic spirituality from counterfeit religion, and genuine wisdom from sophisticated foolishness. The seventh dark secret involves the numerical and geometric codes embedded within the structure of Proverbs itself. Ancient Hebrew culture understood that divine truth operates through mathematical principles and geometric relationships that reflect cosmic order. The arrangement of chapters, the organization of individual proverbs, and even the specific word choices follow numerical patterns that encode additional layers of meaning beyond the surface text. The number 7 appears with extraordinary frequency throughout Proverbs, not as coincidence but as deliberate encoding of completion, perfection, and divine order. 7 pillars of wisdom, 7-fold punishment, 7 types of people the Lord hates. Each occurrence points toward the underlying mathematical structure that governs both cosmic reality and human experience. Understanding these numerical relationships unlocks interpretive keys that transform random collections of wise sayings into systematic instruction in divine mathematics. But the geometric dimension reveals even more sophisticated encoding. The temple architecture that Solomon built following divine specifications reflects the same geometric principles that structure the wisdom literature he inspired. The physical temple becomes a three-dimensional representation of the spiritual principles encoded within Proverbs. Every measurement, every proportion, every architectural relationship in the temple corresponds to wisdom principles that operate in consciousness, relationships, and spiritual development. This connection between architecture and wisdom literature suggests that ancient Hebrew culture understood reality itself as fundamentally geometric and mathematical. The same divine intelligence that established cosmic order through mathematical relationships also structured human consciousness and spiritual development according to geometric principles. Proverbs functions as the instruction manual for aligning human consciousness with these underlying cosmic patterns. The eighth dark secret involves the prophetic timeline embedded within Proverbs that most readers never recognize. While the book appears to offer timeless wisdom applicable to any era, careful analysis reveals that it actually describes a specific historical progression from the establishment of divine wisdom through its corruption and ultimate restoration. The various types of people described in Proverbs represent different stages in this prophetic unfolding. The simple person who lacks experience represents humanity in its original innocent state before the corruption of wisdom traditions. The fool embodies the active rejection of divine truth that characterizes periods of spiritual apostasy. The scoffer represents the sophisticated opposition to divine wisdom that emerges during times of intellectual pride and cultural rebellion. The wise person points toward the restoration of authentic spiritual understanding that will characterize the ultimate triumph of divine purposes. But this prophetic dimension becomes even more specific when you realize that the progression described in Proverbs corresponds to the larger biblical narrative of paradise, lost and regained. The Garden of Eden represents the original state of wisdom, where human consciousness operated in direct harmony with divine truth. The fall represents the corruption of wisdom into foolishness, where human intelligence becomes disconnected from divine source. The various stages of biblical history represent the gradual restoration of authentic wisdom through divine intervention. The ultimate fulfillment of this prophetic pattern points toward what Revelation calls the New Jerusalem, where the tree of life grows beside the river of life for the healing of the nations. This isn't just metaphorical language about individual salvation. It's systematic description of the restoration of cosmic order through the triumph of authentic divine wisdom over all forms of counterfeit knowledge and deceptive understanding. The ninth dark secret involves the psychological manipulation techniques encoded within Proverbs that reveal sophisticated ancient understanding of human behavior, modification, and consciousness control. While these techniques can be used for beneficial purposes like education and spiritual development, they also reveal how the same principles can be employed for manipulation, deception, and social control. The repeated emphasis on the power of words, the importance of timing and communication, and the strategic use of questions rather than direct statements reveals advanced understanding of persuasion psychology that wouldn't be formally studied until modern times. The wise person in Proverbs doesn't just possess correct information. They understand how to present truth in ways that bypass psychological resistance and create genuine transformation in listeners. But this raises disturbing questions about how these same techniques might be misused by those who possess wisdom knowledge but lack moral restraint. The strange woman who seduces the simple through flattering words and appealing presentation represents the dark mirror image of authentic wisdom teaching. She uses the same communication techniques but for destructive rather than constructive purposes. The implications of this psychological dimension extend into contemporary concerns about propaganda, media manipulation, and social engineering. Understanding how Proverbs describes the mechanics of persuasion and influence provides tools for recognizing when these techniques are being used against you rather than for your benefit. Every principle of wise communication can be inverted into a method of deception and control. The 10th dark secret involves the economic and political dimensions of wisdom that most interpretations completely ignore. Proverbs isn't just concerned with individual moral development. It's deeply engaged with questions of justice, economic policy, social organization, and political governance. The wisdom principles it teaches have direct implications for how societies should be structured and governed. The frequent discussions of poverty and wealth, justice and oppression, honest business practices and corrupt leadership reveal that biblical wisdom addresses systematic social issues rather than just personal moral choices. The wise ruler described in Proverbs represents more than individual righteousness. They embody principles of governance that create social conditions where wisdom can flourish and foolishness is restrained. But the political dimension of Proverbs becomes controversial when you realize that it implicitly critiques most forms of human government and economic organization. The wisdom principles it teaches are fundamentally incompatible with systems based on exploitation, deception, or the concentration of power in the hands of those who lack moral restraint. True wisdom governance would require leaders who possess not just intelligence and capability, but also deep moral development and spiritual maturity. This creates tension with those who benefit from existing power structures, and explains why certain interpretations of Proverbs focus exclusively on individual moral development, while ignoring its systematic social critique. Keeping wisdom privatized and individualized prevents people from recognizing how biblical principles challenge unjust social arrangements and corrupt leadership patterns. The 11th dark secret involves the hidden connections between Proverbs and the esoteric traditions that would later emerge in various mystical movements throughout history. The same wisdom principles encoded within this ancient Hebrew text appear in transformed versions within Christian mysticism, Jewish Kabbalah, Islamic Sufism, and other contemplative traditions that claim access to hidden spiritual knowledge. This isn't coincidental borrowing or cultural influence. It suggests that Proverbs preserves authentic spiritual principles that transcend particular religious forms and cultural expressions. The wisdom it contains represents universal truths about consciousness, reality, and spiritual development that appear wherever human beings seriously pursue spiritual growth and divine understanding. But this universality raises troubling questions for those who insist on the exclusive validity of particular religious interpretations. If the wisdom in Proverbs appears in transformed versions across multiple spiritual traditions, what does this say about claims to religious exclusivity and doctrinal uniqueness? The answer may be that divine wisdom transcends human religious categories while working through them to accomplish purposes that extend beyond any single cultural or institutional expression. The connections between Proverbs and later esoteric traditions also suggest that much of what gets dismissed as occult or heretical knowledge may actually represent authentic spiritual principles that have been driven underground by institutional religious authorities who, over transform, prefer controllable doctrine of spiritual experience. Understanding these connections doesn't require accepting all claims made by various mystical traditions, but it does demand more nuanced evaluation of what constitutes authentic spirituality versus mere religious conformity. The 12th dark secret involves the gender dynamics and feminine wisdom traditions that Proverbs both preserves and conceals. Beyond the obvious personification of wisdom as female, the text contains subtle teachings about the spiritual significance of feminine consciousness and its role in authentic spiritual development. the wise woman who builds her house, the virtuous woman whose price is far above rubies, and the mother whose teaching is praised alongside the father's instruction, all point toward feminine wisdom traditions that were more prominent in ancient Hebrew culture than later interpretations acknowledge. But these feminine wisdom elements have been systematically minimized or reinterpreted to conform to patriarchal religious structures that emerged in later periods. The result is that most readers encounter Proverbs through interpretive lenses that obscure its original appreciation for feminine spiritual authority and wisdom transmission. Recovering these hidden feminine dimensions doesn't require adopting contemporary feminist ideologies, but it does demand honest recognition of what the ancient text actually says about women's roles in wisdom cultivation and spiritual instruction. The implications of this feminine wisdom tradition extend into questions about spiritual authority, religious leadership, and the nature of divine revelation itself. If authentic wisdom transmission has always included feminine as well as masculine dimensions, then religious systems that exclude or minimize feminine spiritual authority may be operating from incomplete understanding of how divine wisdom actually functions in human consciousness and community life. These 12 dark secrets represent only the beginning of the hidden mysteries concealed within Proverbs. Each revelation opens doorways into even deeper questions about the nature of divine wisdom, the structure of reality, and the ultimate purposes toward which human consciousness and history are moving. But recognizing these hidden dimensions requires abandoning comfortable assumptions about what biblical wisdom literature is supposed to mean and developing the courage to follow the evidence wherever it leads, regardless of how it challenges established religious and cultural authorities. The most disturbing aspect of these revelations isn't their content, but the systematic effort that has been made to keep them hidden from ordinary believers and students of Scripture. The same religious institutions that claim to preserve and teach biblical truth have often been the most effective barriers to understanding what these ancient texts actually contain. This pattern of concealment and misdirection raises fundamental questions about religious authority, scriptural interpretation, and the difference between authentic spiritual wisdom and institutional religious control. What makes these revelations even more unsettling is the discovery that this pattern of concealment isn't accidental or incidental. It's systematic, deliberate, and has been operating for centuries. The 13th dark secret hidden within Proverbs involves the ancient practice of dual-level teaching, where the wisdom literature was intentionally crafted to communicate different messages to different audiences simultaneously. The surface level provided acceptable moral instruction for ordinary believers, while the deeper levels contained advanced spiritual knowledge reserved for those capable of handling more complex truths. This wasn't deception in the modern sense. It was sophisticated educational methodology that recognized not everyone possesses the same capacity for spiritual understanding at the same time. The simple person described in Proverbs represents those who need basic moral guidance, while the wise person embodies those ready for advanced spiritual instruction. The same text serves both audiences without compromising either level of teaching. But here's where this ancient educational approach becomes problematic in contemporary religious contexts. Modern institutional structures tend to flatten all spiritual instruction to the lowest common denominator, ensuring that everyone receives the same simplified interpretation regardless of their capacity for deeper understanding. This creates a situation where the advanced teachings embedded within Proverbs remain perpetually hidden, because religious authorities fear that acknowledging multiple levels of meaning might undermine their control over scriptural interpretation. The 14th dark secret involves the prophetic warning system embedded throughout Proverbs that most readers never recognize because they're focused on individual moral lessons rather than collective spiritual patterns. The book doesn't just describe personal character development. It maps the predictable progression of spiritual decline that affects families, communities, nations and entire civilizations when they abandon authentic wisdom principles. The fool isn't just an individual character type. The fool represents societies that reject divine wisdom in favor of human cleverness. The scoffer embodies cultures that mock spiritual truth and elevate intellectual pride above moral development. The simple person represents populations that remain spiritually naive and easily manipulated by those who understand how to exploit their lack of discernment. When you read Proverbs through this prophetic lens, you begin to see that it's describing the exact spiritual and cultural patterns that characterize our contemporary world. The warnings about financial corruption, political deception, sexual immorality, and social injustice weren't just relevant to ancient times. They were prophetic descriptions of the conditions that would emerge when entire civilizations abandon the wisdom principles that maintain spiritual and social order. This prophetic dimension becomes even more disturbing when you realize that the progression described in Proverbs appears to be accelerating in our current historical moment. The simple are becoming more easily deceived, the foolish are becoming more aggressively ignorant, and the scoffers are becoming more systematically opposed to any of transformandant truth or moral authority. The 15th dark secret involves the hidden curriculum of spiritual warfare that runs throughout Proverbs like a strategic military manual disguised as moral instruction. Every teaching about wisdom versus foolishness, righteousness versus wickedness, truth versus deception represents tactical guidance for engaging in spiritual conflict against forces that seek to corrupt human consciousness and destroy authentic spiritual development. The strange woman, who seduces the simple through flattering words and appealing presentation, represents more than individual temptation. She embodies systematic deception that operates through cultural institutions, media manipulation, educational indoctrination, and religious corruption. Understanding her tactics isn't just about avoiding personal moral failure. It's about recognizing how entire populations can be seduced into accepting lies as truth, and calling evil good while condemning good as evil. The wise person's ability to see hidden opportunities, recognize secret enemies, and distinguish between genuine friends and deceptive allies represents advanced training in spiritual discernment that has direct applications to contemporary spiritual warfare. Every principle of wisdom in Proverbs can be understood as instruction for navigating a world where spiritual deception has become increasingly sophisticated and pervasive. But this spiritual warfare dimension reveals something even more disturbing about why these teachings have been kept hidden. Those who benefit from maintaining populations in spiritual ignorance and moral confusion have every interest in preventing people from developing the kind of discernment that Proverbs teaches. Advanced spiritual wisdom poses a direct threat to systems built on deception, exploitation, and the manipulation of human consciousness. The 16th dark secret involves the economic prophecy embedded within Proverbs that describes the inevitable collapse of financial systems built on dishonest weights and measures, exploitation of the poor, and the concentration of wealth in the hands of those who lack moral restraint. The book doesn't just offer individual advice about personal finance. It reveals the spiritual laws that govern economic systems and predict their ultimate success or failure. The repeated warnings about dishonest business practices, corrupt legal systems, and the oppression of the poor aren't just moral teachings. They're economic prophecy that describes the spiritual dynamics that determine whether financial systems will prosper or collapse. When societies violate these principles on a systematic level, they create conditions that inevitably lead to economic instability, social unrest, and eventual collapse. Understanding this prophetic economic dimension transforms how you read contemporary financial and political developments. The same spiritual principles that Proverbs describes are still operating today, creating predictable patterns of rise and decline in nations, institutions, and economic systems. Those who understand these principles can recognize warning signs and prepare for changes that others won't see coming until it's too late. The 17th dark secret involves the psychological manipulation techniques that Proverbs both exposes and teaches readers to recognize. The book contains sophisticated analysis of how human consciousness can be influenced, controlled, and directed through various forms of communication, social pressure, and environmental conditioning. This knowledge can be used for beneficial purposes like education and spiritual development, but it also reveals how the same principles can be employed for deception and control. The descriptions of how the strange woman seduces her victims through flattering speech, appealing presentation, and the creation of artificial intimacy represent detailed analysis of psychological manipulation techniques that remain effective thousands of years later. Understanding these patterns provides protection against those who would use similar methods for harmful purposes. But the psychological dimension of Proverbs extends beyond individual manipulation into mass psychology and social engineering. The book describes how entire populations can be influenced through the systematic application of wisdom or foolishness at cultural levels. The principles it teaches about communication, influence, and persuasion have direct applications to understanding how modern media, education, and political systems shape collective consciousness. The 18th dark secret involves the hidden medical and health teachings embedded within Proverbs that reveal sophisticated understanding of the connections between spiritual condition, emotional states, and physical health. The book doesn't separate spiritual wisdom from bodily well-being, but treats them as interconnected aspects of human flourishing that must be addressed together. The frequent references to the heart, not as mere metaphor but as the central organ that integrates spiritual, emotional, and physical health, reveal advanced understanding of psychosomatic medicine that wouldn't be formally recognized until modern times. The teachings about emotions like anger, fear, worry, and joy aren't just moral instruction. They're medical guidance about how different emotional states affect physical health and spiritual development. Understanding this medical dimension transforms how you read the practical advice in Proverbs about lifestyle, relationships, and daily habits. Every teaching about moderation, self-control, and healthy relationships becomes instruction for maintaining optimal physical health through proper spiritual and emotional development. The 19th dark secret involves the astronomical and calendrical codes embedded within the structure and content of Proverbs that reflect ancient understanding of cosmic cycles and their influence on human consciousness and historical development. The wisdom literature wasn't created in isolation from ancient astronomical knowledge, but incorporates a sophisticated understanding of how celestial patterns affect earthly events. The references to times and seasons, the emphasis on proper timing in human affairs, and the cyclical nature of many teachings reflect advanced understanding of how cosmic rhythms influence both individual development and collective historical patterns. This astronomical dimension suggests that the wisdom in Proverbs was designed to help readers align their lives with beneficial cosmic influences while avoiding periods when negative forces are most active. But this astronomical knowledge raises uncomfortable questions for those who prefer to keep biblical wisdom separated from what they consider occult or esoteric knowledge. The same cosmic principles that Proverbs incorporates appear in various forms throughout ancient wisdom traditions, suggesting that authentic spiritual wisdom has always included understanding of how celestial patterns influence human consciousness and earthly events. The 20th dark secret involves the genetic and hereditary teachings in Proverbs that reveal sophisticated understanding of how spiritual and moral characteristics are transmitted across generations through both biological and cultural inheritance. The book doesn't treat individual moral development as occurring in isolation, but recognizes how family patterns, cultural traditions, and ancestral influences shape personal character and spiritual capacity. the teachings about the sins of the fathers affecting children and grandchildren, the importance of proper training in early childhood, and the way foolishness tends wisdom or itself across generations reveal advanced understanding of what to reproduce. Modern psychology calls intergenerational trauma and inherited behavioral patterns. Understanding this hereditary dimension helps explain why some individuals seem naturally drawn toward wisdom, while others appear predisposed toward foolishness, despite similar environmental influences. The spiritual condition of previous generations creates either advantages or disadvantages that affect the spiritual development of their descendants. The 21st Dark Secret involves the linguistic and linguistic codes embedded within the original Hebrew text of Proverbs that are completely lost in translation, but reveal additional layers of meaning through wordplay, numerical values, and symbolic relationships between different Hebrew letters and words. The ancient Hebrew language operated as both communication system and encoding mechanism that preserved esoteric knowledge within seemingly simple statements. The Hebrew letters themselves carried numerical values, symbolic meanings, and mystical associations that added layers of significance to every word and phrase. Understanding these linguistic codes transforms individual proverbs from simple moral statements into complex symbolic teachings that operate on multiple levels simultaneously. But accessing these linguistic dimensions requires knowledge of ancient Hebrew that most contemporary readers don't possess, creating a situation where the deeper meanings remain hidden behind translation barriers that few people are equipped to cross. This linguistic concealment ensures that the advanced teachings remain accessible only to those who invest the considerable time and effort required to master the original language. The 22nd Dark Secret involves the architectural and temple symbolism that runs throughout Proverbs and connects the wisdom literature to the sacred geometry and spiritual principles that governed ancient temple construction. The frequent references to building, foundations, pillars, and architectural elements aren't casual metaphors, but systematic teachings about how spiritual principles create stable structures in consciousness, relationships, and social organization. The wise woman who builds her house, the 7 pillars of wisdom, and the various descriptions of construction and destruction architecture that Solomon processes all connect to the temple built according to divine specifications. Understanding these architectural connections reveals that Proverbs functions as instruction for building spiritual temples within human consciousness that reflect the same geometric and proportional relationships that governed physical temple construction. The 23rd Dark Secret involves the musical and harmonic principles embedded within Proverbs that reveal how wisdom operates through vibrational and frequency relationships that affect both individual consciousness and collective social harmony. The references to singing, musical instruments, and harmonic relationships aren't just poetic imagery, but descriptions of how spiritual truth operates through sound, vibration, and harmonic resonance. The connection between wisdom and music suggests that authentic spiritual understanding involves developing sensitivity to the harmonic principles that govern both cosmic order and human consciousness. Those who develop this harmonic sensitivity can recognize when social, political, or spiritual situations are operating in harmony with divine principles versus when they're creating discord and dissonance. These 23 dark secrets represent only a fraction of the hidden knowledge concealed within Proverbs. Each revelation opens pathways into even deeper mysteries about the nature of reality, consciousness, and the ultimate purposes toward which human development and history are progressing. But recognizing these hidden dimensions requires abandoning comfortable assumptions about what biblical wisdom literature is supposed to mean, and developing the intellectual courage to follow evidence wherever it leads. The most disturbing aspect of these revelations isn't their content, but the recognition that this knowledge has been systematically concealed from those who might benefit most from understanding it. The same institutions that claim to preserve and teach biblical truth have often been the most effective barriers to accessing what these ancient texts actually contain. This pattern of concealment raises fundamental questions about the relationship between institutional religious authority and authentic spiritual wisdom. If the deepest truths embedded within Scripture require advanced study, spiritual development, and intellectual honesty to access, then what does this say about religious systems that discourage such investigation in favor of simplified interpretations that support existing power structures? But perhaps the most significant implication of these hidden teachings is their relevance to contemporary spiritual and cultural challenges. The wisdom principles embedded within Proverbs weren't just applicable to ancient times. They were prophetic descriptions of the spiritual dynamics that would characterize human civilization throughout history, including our current moment when many of these ancient warnings appear to be reaching their ultimate fulfillment. Understanding the dark secrets hidden within Proverbs isn't just academic exercise or spiritual curiosity. It's practical preparation for navigating a world where spiritual deception has become increasingly sophisticated, where traditional sources of authority are proving unreliable, and where the ability to distinguish between authentic wisdom and counterfeit knowledge has become essential for spiritual survival. The question that emerges from these revelations isn't whether you're ready to accept uncomfortable truths about biblical wisdom literature. The question is whether you're prepared to develop the kind of spiritual discernment that these ancient texts were designed to cultivate in those who encounter them with adequate preparation and sincere desire for authentic understanding. Because once you begin to see the patterns hidden within Proverbs, you start recognizing similar patterns throughout other biblical texts, historical events, and contemporary spiritual and cultural developments. The wisdom literature wasn't just ancient moral instruction. It was advanced training in spiritual perception that remains as relevant today as it was when it was first written. But accessing this advanced training requires something that many contemporary readers find difficult to accept. It requires acknowledging that spiritual truth operates through levels of understanding that not everyone is ready to access at the same time. And that authentic spiritual development involves progressing through stages of knowledge and wisdom that can't be rushed or simplified without losing their essential character. The dark secrets hidden within Proverbs aren't dark because they're evil or dangerous. They're dark because they've been concealed beneath layers of misinterpretation, institutional control, and cultural conditioning that prevent most people from seeing what these ancient texts actually contain. But for those willing to dig deeper, to question comfortable assumptions, and to follow evidence wherever it leads, these hidden treasures of wisdom remain as accessible today as they were to the ancient sages who first encoded them within seemingly simple moral teachings. The journey into the hidden depths of biblical wisdom isn't for everyone, but for those who undertake it seriously, it opens doorways into understanding that transforms not just how you read Scripture, but how you perceive reality itself. The 24th dark secret involves the occult knowledge systems that Solomon himself engaged with, knowledge that directly influenced the wisdom literature attributed to his name. Ancient sources reveal that Solomon's legendary wisdom wasn't limited to conventional religious understanding, but extended into what later traditions would call forbidden arts. The king, who built the first temple, also studied astrology, invoked spiritual entities, and developed systematic approaches to manipulating unseen forces that operated beyond normal human perception. This isn't speculation based on medieval legends or occult fantasies. Historical documents from antiquity describe Solomon's involvement with practices that mainstream religious interpretation either ignores completely or dismisses as later fabrications. But the evidence suggests that Solomon's wisdom included sophisticated understanding of spiritual hierarchies, angelic and demonic forces, and methods for influalities that most people never seeing invisible re-recognize exist. The implications of this revelation are staggering. If the wisdom literature attributed to Solomon was influenced by his study of esoteric practices, then Proverbs contains encoded knowledge about spiritual realms and forces that operate according to principles most readers never encounter in conventional religious instruction. Every teaching about invisible realities, spiritual warfare, and the hidden influences that shape human behavior becomes potentially connected to Solomon's advanced knowledge of occult principles. But here's where this gets truly disturbing. The same king who possessed this extraordinary esoteric knowledge ultimately fell into spiritual apostasy and political disaster. Despite having access to wisdom that surpassed every other human being of his era, Solomon ended his reign in corruption, idolatry, and the division of his kingdom. This suggests that intellectual knowledge of spiritual principles, no matter how advanced or accurate, isn't sufficient for spiritual success without proper moral development and spiritual discipline. The 25th dark secret involves the systematic encoding of prophetic information about the end times that most readers never recognize because they're focused on individual moral development rather than eschatological patterns. Proverbs doesn't just describe personal character types. It maps the spiritual conditions that will characterize human civilization during the final stages of history, before divine intervention establishes ultimate justice and righteousness. The progression from simple to wise, or from simple to foolish, represents more than individual spiritual development. It describes the polarization of human consciousness that occurs when divine truth becomes increasingly available, while simultaneously meeting increasingly sophisticated opposition. The wise become wiser, while the foolish become more aggressively ignorant, creating the spiritual conditions that biblical prophecy describes as characterizing the last days. The strange woman who seduces through flattering words and appealing presentation represents the great deception that will characterize the final period of human history. Her methods of seduction correspond precisely to the techniques that Revelation describes being used by the false prophet and the beast system to deceive the nations. Understanding her tactics and Proverbs provides preparation for recognizing similar deception when it operates on global scales through political, religious, and cultural institutions. The 26th dark secret involves the hidden medical knowledge that Proverbs contains about the connections between spiritual condition, emotional states, and physical health. The ancient Hebrew understanding of human nature didn't separate spirit, soul, and body into disconnected categories, but recognized them as interconnected aspects of unified beings that affect each other in predictable ways. The frequent references to the heart as the center of both spiritual and physical life reflect sophisticated understanding of what modern medicine calls psychosomatic relationships. The teachings about emotions like fear, anger, worry, and joy aren't just moral instruction. They're medical guidance about how different emotional and spiritual states create either health or disease in physical bodies. The proverbs that connect righteous living with long life and health weren't just promised rewards for good behavior. They were descriptions of natural laws that govern how spiritual and moral conditions affect physical well-being. Understanding these connections transforms every teaching about lifestyle, relationships, and daily habits into medical instruction for maintaining optimal health through proper spiritual development. But this medical dimension reveals something troubling about contemporary approaches to health and healing. It describes the connections between spiritual condition, Proverbs accurately, and physical health, then medical systems that ignore spiritual factors in disease and healing are operating from incomplete understanding of how human beings actually function. The separation of medical treatment from spiritual development may be preventing people from accessing the most powerful healing resources available to human consciousness. The 27th dark secret involves the economic prophecy that Proverbs contains about the inevitable collapse of financial systems built on dishonest foundations. The repeated warnings about dishonest weights and measures, exploitation of the poor, and corrupt business practices aren't just individual moral guidance. They're systematic analysis of the spiritual laws that determine whether economic systems will prosper or destroy themselves. When societies violate these economic principles on systematic levels, they create spiritual conditions that inevitably lead to financial instability, social unrest, and eventual collapse. The same forces that cause individual financial ruin when people violate wisdom principles also operate on collective levels to bring down entire economic systems that are built on spiritual violations. Understanding this economic prophecy transforms how you interpret contemporary financial and political developments. The spiritual principles that Proverbs describes are still operating today, creating predictable patterns in the rise and fall of nations, institutions, and economic systems. Those who understand these principles can recognize warning signs and prepare for changes that others won't see coming until destruction has already begun. The 28th dark secret involves the psychological warfare techniques that Proverbs both exposes and teaches readers to recognize. The book contains detailed analysis of how human consciousness can be manipulated, controlled, and directed through various forms of communication, social pressure, and environmental conditioning. This knowledge can be used beneficially for education and spiritual development, but it also reveals how the same principles can be employed for deception and social control. The descriptions of how the adulterous woman operates through flattering speech, artificial intimacy, and the systematic breaking down of moral resistance represent sophisticated analysis of psychological manipulation that remains effective thousands of years after it was first described. Understanding these patterns provides protection against those who would use similar methods for harmful purposes But the psychological dimension extends beyond individual manipulation into mass psychology and social contemporary contexts engineering. Proverbs describes how entire populations can be influenced through the systematic application of these principles at cultural levels. The wisdom it teaches about communication, influence, and persuasion has direct applications to understanding how modern media, educational systems, and political institutions shape collective consciousness and behavior. The 29th dark secret involves the genetic and hereditary teachings that reveal how spiritual and moral characteristics are transmitted across generations through both biological and cultural inheritance. Proverbs doesn't treat individual development as occurring in isolation, but recognizes how family patterns, ancestral influences, and generational curses or blessings affect personal character and spiritual capacity. The teachings about the sins of the fathers affecting multiple generations, the importance of early childhood training, and the way that both wisdom and foolishness tend to reproduce themselves across family lines reveal advanced understanding of what modern psychology calls intergenerational trauma and inherited behavioral patterns. But the biblical understanding goes deeper than psychological explanations by recognizing spiritual dimensions of hereditary influence that operate according to principles most contemporary approaches to family dynamics never consider. Understanding this hereditary dimension helps explain why some individuals seem naturally drawn toward wisdom, while others appear predisposed toward foolishness, despite similar environmental influences. The spiritual condition of previous generations creates either advantages or disadvantages that affect the spiritual development of their descendants in ways that can't be explained through purely environmental or genetic factors. The 30th dark secret involves the astronomical codes that are embedded within the structure and timing of Proverbs' teachings. The wisdom literature wasn't created in isolation from ancient understanding of cosmic cycles and their influence on human consciousness and historical development. The references to proper timing, seasons, and the cyclical nature of many teachings reflect sophisticated knowledge of how celestial patterns affect both individual development and collective historical patterns. This astronomical dimension suggests that the wisdom in Proverbs was designed to help readers align their lives with beneficial cosmic influences, while avoiding periods when negative forces are most active. The emphasis on discerning times and seasons isn't just practical advice about human affairs. It's instruction in reading the cosmic signs that indicate when different types of spiritual and practical activities are most likely to succeed or fail. But this astronomical knowledge raises uncomfortable questions for those who prefer to separate biblical wisdom from what they consider occult or esoteric knowledge. The same cosmic principles that Proverbs incorporates appear in various forms throughout ancient wisdom traditions, suggesting that authentic spiritual understanding has always included awareness of how celestial patterns influence earthly events and human consciousness. The 31st dark secret involves the architectural symbolism that connects Proverbs to the sacred geometry and spiritual principles that governed ancient temple construction. The frequent references to building, foundations, pillars, and construction processes aren't casual metaphors, but systematic teachings about how spiritual principles create stable structures in consciousness, relationships, and social organization. The wise woman who builds her house represents more than good domestic management. She embodies the feminine principle of wisdom that constructs spiritual temples within human consciousness according to the same geometric and proportional relationships that governed the construction of Solomon's physical temple. The 7 pillars of wisdom correspond to the sevenfold structure that appears throughout ancient sacred architecture and connects earthly constructions to cosmic patterns. Understanding these architectural connections reveals that Proverbs functions as instruction manual for building spiritual temples within human consciousness that reflect divine order and provide stable foundations for advanced spiritual development. Every teaching about construction and destruction becomes guidance for either building or tearing down the spiritual structures that determine individual character and collective social stability. The 32nd dark secret involves the musical and harmonic principles that reveal how wisdom operates through vibrational and frequency relationships. The references to singing, musical instruments, and harmonic relationships aren't just poetic imagery but descriptions of how spiritual truth operates through sound, vibration, and resonance that affects both individual consciousness and collective social harmony. The connection between wisdom and music suggests that authentic spiritual understanding involves developing sensitivity to harmonic principles that govern both cosmic order and human consciousness. Those who develop this sensitivity can recognize when social, political, or spiritual situations are operating in harmony with divine principles versus when they're creating discord and dissonance that leads to conflict and destruction. This harmonic dimension explains why certain combinations of people, ideas, or circumstances create that can't be explained through surface either harmony or discord in Wey's level analysis. The spiritual principles that Proverbs teaches operate through vibrational relationships that determine whether different elements will reinforce each other constructively or interfere with each other destructively. The 33rd dark secret involves the initiation process that Proverbs describes for those who seek to progress from simple understanding through various stages of wisdom development toward ultimate spiritual maturity. The book doesn't just provide random moral teachings. It maps a systematic curriculum for consciousness development that guides seekers through predictable stages of spiritual growth. The simple person represents those who are beginning the journey toward wisdom but lack experience and discernment. The wise person embodies those who have progressed through intermediate stages and developed reliable judgment in spiritual matters. But beyond the wise person, Proverbs points toward even higher levels of understanding that transcend ordinary human wisdom and approach divine consciousness itself. Understanding this initiatory dimension transforms how you read the practical teachings in Proverbs. Every instruction becomes a lesson designed for specific stages of spiritual development. What appears as contradiction or inconsistency often represents different teachings, appropriate for different levels of consciousness and spiritual maturity. The 34th dark secret involves the prophetic calendar that Proverbs contains regarding the timing of major spiritual and historical transitions. The wisdom literature doesn't just provide timeless moral instruction. It encodes information about the spiritual seasons and cycles that determine when different types of divine activity will manifest in human history. The references to harvest times, planting seasons, and the proper timing for various activities connect to larger patterns of spiritual development that operate on both individual and collective levels. Understanding these timing principles provides insight into when personal, spiritual breakthroughs are most likely to occur, and when historical events that fulfill biblical prophecy should be expected to unfold. But this prophetic timing dimension reveals that we may be living during a significant multiple period, when particularly cycles are converging to create conditions for unprecedented spiritual and historical developments. The same patterns that Proverbs describes on individual levels appear to be manifesting on global scales, in ways that suggest we're approaching major transitions in human consciousness and civilization. The 35th dark secret involves the consciousness technology that Proverbs teaches for developing enhanced perception, intuitive knowledge, and direct spiritual knowing that transcends ordinary mental processes. The wise person described in these ancient texts possesses capabilities that go far beyond normal human intelligence or learned knowledge. The ability to see what others cannot see, to recognize hidden opportunities and concealed dangers, to understand the motivations and intentions of others, and to know things that haven't been explicitly communicated, represents advanced consciousness capabilities that Proverbs teaches can be developed through proper spiritual discipline and moral development. Understanding this consciousness technology reveals that the wisdom literature contains practical instruction for developing what later traditions would call psychic abilities, intuitive knowing, and direct spiritual perception. But these capabilities are presented not as supernatural gifts, but as natural potentials that become available when human consciousness operates according to divine principles. These 35 dark secrets represent layers of hidden knowledge that transform Proverbs from simple moral instruction into sophisticated training manual for advanced spiritual development, consciousness evolution, and preparation for navigating the complex spiritual dynamics that characterize both individual growth and collective historical transitions. But recognizing these hidden dimensions requires something that most contemporary readers find challenging. It requires acknowledging that authentic spiritual wisdom operates through levels of understanding that can't be simplified or democratized without losing their essential power and effectiveness. The same accessibility that makes religious teaching appealing to mass audiences often destroys the very qualities that make it spiritually transformative for serious seekers. The question that emerges from these revelations isn't whether you're intellectually capable of understanding hidden knowledge. The question is whether you're spiritually prepared to handle the responsibilities that come with advanced understanding, and whether you possess the moral development necessary to use such knowledge constructively rather than destructively. Because the same principles that can elevate consciousness and facilitate spiritual growth can also be misused for manipulation, control, and the exploitation of those who lack adequate spiritual discernment. This is why ancient wisdom traditions surrounded advanced teachings with safeguards, requirements, and testing processes designed to ensure that powerful knowledge reached only those who were prepared to handle it responsibly. The dark secrets hidden within Proverbs remain as relevant today as they were when they were first encoded within seemingly simple moral teachings. But accessing them requires developing the kind of spiritual maturity, intellectual honesty, and moral courage that these ancient texts were designed to cultivate in those who encounter them with adequate preparation and genuine desire for authentic transformation. The journey into the hidden depths of biblical wisdom isn't just academic exercise or spiritual curiosity. It's practical preparation for developing the consciousness capabilities and spiritual discernment that become increasingly necessary as human civilization that will test approaches, transitions every individual's capacity for distinct, authentic anishing between counterfeit sources of truth, wisdom, and spiritual authority. The 36th dark secret involves the technological prophecy embedded within Proverbs that describes artificial intelligence, genetic manipulation, and consciousness control technologies thousands of years before their physical manifestation. The ancient Hebrew concepts of creating speaking images, animating lifeless forms, and manipulating human consciousness through artificial means weren't primitive superstitions. They were prophetic descriptions of technological capabilities that would eventually emerge during the final stages of human civilization. The references to graven images that speak, artificial beings that influence human behavior, and systems of control that operate through deceptive communication all point toward technologies that are manifesting in our contemporary world through digital media, artificial intelligence, and sophisticated psychological manipulation systems. Understanding these prophetic technological warnings provides crucial preparation for navigating a world where the boundary between authentic human consciousness and artificial manipulation becomes increasingly difficult to distinguish. But this technological dimension reveals something deeply disturbing about the spiritual forces behind advanced technology. The same entities that ancient texts describe as fallen angels or demonic intelligences appear to be working through human technological development to create systems of control and consciousness manipulation that serve their ultimate purposes of deceiving and destroying human beings who were created in the divine image. The 37th dark secret involves the biological warfare prophecy that Proverbs contains regarding diseases, plagues, and biological weapons that would be used during the final stages of human history. The descriptions of wasting diseases, corrupted blood, and sicknesses that spread through contaminated food and water weren't just natural consequences of moral corruption. They were prophetic warnings about intentional biological attacks that would be used to control and eliminate human populations. The connection between spiritual corruption and physical disease that runs throughout Proverbs operates on both individual and collective levels. When entire societies violate the spiritual principles that maintain health and vitality, they create conditions that make them vulnerable to biological weapons and engineered diseases that specifically target populations with compromised spiritual and physical immunity. Understanding this biological prophecy transforms how you interpret contemporary health crises, pharmaceutical interventions, and medical policies that seem designed more to create dependence and control than to promote genuine healing and vitality. The same spiritual principles that protect individuals from disease and corruption also provide collective protection when entire communities operate according to divine health laws. The 38th dark secret involves the educational warfare system that Proverbs describes, where knowledge itself becomes a weapon used to either elevate or destroy human consciousness. The contrast between authentic education that develops wisdom and counterfeit education that produces sophisticated foolishness represents more than individual learning differences. It describes systematic educational warfare designed to shape collective human consciousness toward either divine purposes or demonic deception. The fool in Proverbs isn't just someone who lacks information. The fool represents those who have been educated into believing lies so convincing and sophisticated that they become immune to authentic truth. This educational corruption operates through academic institutions, media systems, and cultural programming that systematically replaces divine wisdom with human cleverness, disguised as advanced knowledge. But the educational warfare dimension reveals that authentic wisdom education has always operated through different methods and principles than conventional academic instruction. True wisdom transmission requires spiritual preparation, moral development, and consciousness transformation that can't be achieved through purely intellectual approaches or institutional programming. The 39th dark secret involves the genetic modification prophecy that describes the corruption of human DNA and the creation of hybrid beings that combine human and non-human genetic material. The references to strange flesh, corrupted seed, and beings that don't properly belong to either heaven or earth weren't just describing ancient mythological creatures. They were prophetic warnings about genetic manipulation technologies that would be used to corrupt the divine image within human beings. The Nephilim described in ancient texts represent the same phenomenon that contemporary genetic modification technologies are beginning to create through the combination of human DNA with artificial genetic sequences, animal genetic material, and potentially non-terrestrial genetic information. Understanding this genetic prophecy provides crucial preparation for recognizing and resisting genetic modifications that are presented as medical improvements, but actually function to corrupt human consciousness and disconnect people from divine source. But this genetic dimension reveals something even more disturbing about the ultimate purposes behind advanced genetic technologies. The same entities that corrupted human genetics in ancient times appear to be working through contemporary scientific institutions to complete their original project of creating hybrid beings that can't access authentic spiritual consciousness or divine relationship. The 40th dark secret involves the consciousness uploading prophecy that describes attempts to transfer human consciousness into artificial systems, creating digital immortality that actually represents a form of technological hell, where souls become trapped in artificial realities controlled by malevolent intelligences. The ancient descriptions of souls being bound in artificial containers, speaking through lifeless images, and existing in false realities weren't primitive mythology, but prophetic warnings about technologies that are beginning to emerge in our contemporary world. The promise of digital immortality through consciousness uploading represents the ultimate deception where human beings are convinced to abandon their divinely created bodies and souls in exchange for artificial existence that appears to offer eternal life, but actually provides eternal imprisonment under the control of entities that hate human beings and seek their ultimate destruction. Understanding this consciousness prophecy reveals why authentic spiritual development emphasizes the integration of spirit, soul, and body, rather than the escape from physical existence into purely spiritual or digital realms. The divine design for human consciousness requires embodied existence that can't be replicated through artificial technologies without losing essential aspects of what makes human beings truly human. The 41st dark secret involves the economic control system that Proverbs describes, where financial mechanisms become tools for enslaving entire populations through debt, artificial scarcity, and the systematic transfer of wealth from many to few. The warnings about dishonest weights and measures, exploitation through compound interest, and the concentration of resources in the hands of those who lack moral restraint weren't just ancient economic advice, but prophetic descriptions of global financial systems that would emerge during the final stages of human history. The beast system described in prophetic literature operates primarily through economic control that makes it impossible for people to buy or sell without submitting to the system's authority and accepting its mark of identification and allegiance. Understanding the economic prophecy in Proverbs provides preparation for recognizing how financial systems can be used to force compliance with spiritual corruption and moral compromise. But this economic dimension reveals that authentic spiritual wisdom includes practical knowledge about creating alternative economic systems based on divine principles of justice, generosity, and mutual aid. The wisdom literature doesn't just warn about corrupt financial systems. It provides blueprints for economic relationships that serve divine purposes and human flourishing rather than exploitation and control. The 42nd dark secret involves the communication control prophecy that describes how language itself becomes corrupted and weaponized to prevent authentic truth from being communicated or understood. The references to confused tongues, twisted speech, and words that mean opposite of their apparent definitions weren't just describing individual deception, but prophetic warnings about systematic language manipulation that would be used to control human consciousness on global scales. The Tower of Babel represents the same phenomenon that contemporary information systems create through the systematic corruption of language, the redefinition of essential terms, and the creation of communication environments where authentic truth becomes increasingly difficult to express or recognize. Understanding this linguistic prophecy provides preparation for maintaining clear communication and genuine understanding, despite systematic efforts to corrupt language and prevent authentic truth transmission. But the communication dimension reveals that authentic spiritual wisdom operates through forms of communication that transcend ordinary language and can't be corrupted through external manipulation. The direct transmission of wisdom from consciousness to consciousness represents communication capabilities that remain accessible even when conventional language systems become completely corrupted and unreliable. The 43rd dark secret involves the religiousy that describes how authentic deception, prophet spiritual teachings, become corrupted from within through the systematic replacement of divine truth with human traditions that appear spiritual but actually lead people away from genuine relationship with divine reality. The warnings about false prophets, deceptive teachers, and religious systems that appear righteous but produce spiritual death weren't just ancient concerns, but prophetic descriptions of religious corruption that would reach unprecedented levels during the final stages of human history. The Great Apostasy, described in prophetic literature, represents the systematic transformation of authentic spiritual communities into institutions that serve the purposes of spiritual deception while maintaining the appearance of religious authority and divine connection. Understanding this religious prophecy provides preparation for distinguishing between authentic spiritual movements and sophisticated counterfeits that use spiritual language and religious forms to accomplish purposes that oppose genuine spiritual development. But this religious dimension reveals that authentic spiritual authority operates through different principles than institutional religious power. True spiritual leadership serves the development of spiritual maturity in others, rather than creating dependence on external religious authorities or systems. The wisdom literature teaches discernment that enables individuals to recognize authentic spiritual teaching regardless of its institutional context or religious packaging. The 44th dark secret involves the consciousness evolution prophecy that describes the emergence of enhanced human capabilities during periods of intense spiritual conflict and testing. The references to increased knowledge, supernatural discernment, and abilities that transcend normal human limitations weren't just promises for the afterlife, but prophetic descriptions of consciousness evolution that would occur among those who maintain authentic spiritual connection during times of unprecedented deception and spiritual warfare. The separation between those who develop enhanced spiritual capabilities and those who remain trapped in ordinary consciousness represents more than individual spiritual development. It describes the polarization of human consciousness that occurs when divine truth becomes increasingly available while simultaneously meeting increasingly sophisticated opposition. Understanding this consciousness prophecy provides preparation for developing the spiritual capabilities that become necessary for navigating reality during periods of intense spiritual conflict. But the consciousness evolution dimension reveals that enhanced spiritual capabilities come with corresponding responsibilities and testing that determine whether these abilities will be used constructively or destructively. The same consciousness technologies that can facilitate genuine spiritual development can also be corrupted into forms of spiritual pride and deception that actually move people further from authentic divine relationship. The 45th dark secret involves the dimensional shift prophecy that describes the transformation of physical reality itself through the intersection of spiritual and material dimensions that creates new possibilities for both divine intervention and demonic manifestation. The references to heaven and earth becoming one, the veil being removed, and spiritual realities becoming visible in physical dimensions weren't just metaphorical descriptions, but prophetic warnings about dimensional changes that would occur during the climactic stages of the cosmic conflict between good and evil. The new heaven and new earth described in prophetic literature represents the ultimate resolution of this dimensional shift, where authentic spiritual reality replaces the corrupted physical systems that have been dominated by forces opposed to divine purposes. Understanding this dimensional prophecy provides preparation for navigating reality during periods when the boundary between spiritual and physical dimensions becomes increasingly permeable and unpredictable. But this dimensional dimension reveals that the same forces that seek to corrupt human consciousness and society are also working to manipulate dimensional shifts for their own purposes. The false signs and wonders that characterize the final deception include dimensional manifestations that appear supernatural and divine, but actually serve the purposes of entities that oppose authentic spiritual development and divine relationship. The 46th dark secret involves the timeline acceleration prophecy that describes how the pace of historical change and spiritual development accelerates dramatically during the final stages of human civilization. The references to shortened days, compressed seasons, and events that occur more rapidly than natural timing suggests weren't just descriptions of subjective time perception, but prophetic warnings about actual changes in the flow of time and the pace of historical development. The acceleration of prophetic fulfillment that characterizes the end times includes not just external events, but also the acceleration of individual spiritual development and consciousness evolution for those who maintain authentic spiritual connection during periods of intense testing and deception. Understanding this timeline prophecy provides preparation for navigating reality during periods when normal patterns of cause and effect, learning and development operate according to accelerated principles. But the timeline acceleration reveals that the same forces that accelerate authentic spiritual development also accelerate spiritual deception and consciousness corruption for those who choose to align themselves with forces that oppose divine purposes. The polarization between wisdom and foolishness that Proverbs describes operates through accelerated timelines that compress what would normally take generations into much shorter periods of intense spiritual conflict. These 46 dark secrets represent comprehensive hidden knowledge that transforms Proverbs from ancient moral instruction into prophetic preparation for navigating the most complex spiritual and technological challenges in human history. But recognizing these prophetic dimensions requires developing the kind of spiritual discernment that can distinguish between authentic divine revelation and sophisticated counterfeits that use prophetic language and spiritual concepts to accomplish purposes that oppose genuine spiritual development. The ultimate question that emerges from these revelations isn't whether you believe in prophecy or accept the possibility of hidden knowledge within ancient texts. The question is whether you possess the spiritual courage and moral development necessary to align yourself with authentic divine purposes during a period when the difference between truth and deception, wisdom and foolishness, authentic spirituality and sophisticated counterfeits becomes the determining factor in individual and collective destiny. Because the same wisdom principles that Proverbs teaches for individual development also provide the foundation for recognizing and resisting systematic deception, consciousness manipulation, and spiritual warfare that operate through technological, educational, religious, and cultural systems designed to prevent human beings from developing authentic spiritual maturity and divine relationship. The dark secrets hidden within Proverbs aren't just ancient mysteries waiting to be discovered by curious scholars. They're practical preparation for developing the consciousness capabilities, spiritual discernment, and moral courage that become increasingly necessary as human civilization approaches transitions that will test every individual's capacity for distinguishing between authentic and counterfeit sources of truth, wisdom, and spiritual authority. Understanding these hidden teachings requires more than intellectual analysis or academic study. It demands the kind of spiritual preparation, moral development, and consciousness transformation that these ancient texts were specifically designed to facilitate in those who encounter them with adequate sincerity and genuine desire for authentic spiritual growth, rather than mere knowledge accumulation or religious entertainment. The journey into the forbidden depths of biblical wisdom literature isn't just about uncovering hidden information. It's about developing the spiritual maturity necessary to handle advanced knowledge responsibly and use it constructively for divine purposes, rather than allowing it to become a source of spiritual pride, intellectual arrogance, or manipulation of others who lack similar understanding. Because the same principles that can elevate consciousness and facilitate genuine spiritual development can also be corrupted into tools for deception, control, and the exploitation of those who haven't yet developed adequate spiritual discernment to recognize the difference between authentic wisdom and sophisticated foolishness disguised as advanced knowledge. The dark secrets hidden within Proverbs remain as relevant and practically applicable today as they were when they were first encoded within seemingly simple moral teachings thousands of years ago. But accessing their full transformative power requires approaching them not as historical curiosities or intellectual puzzles, but as living instruction for developing the consciousness capabilities that become increasingly essential as human civilization enters its most challenging and potentially transformative period in recorded history. The 47th dark secret involves the harvest prophecy that reveals how human souls are systematically sorted and separated according to their spiritual development during the final stages of cosmic conflict. The references to wheat and tares, good fish and bad fish, wise virgins and foolish virgins weren't just parables about individual salvation, but prophetic descriptions of consciousness, sorting processes that operate on both individual and collective levels during periods of intense spiritual testing. This spiritual harvest operates through mechanisms that expose the true spiritual condition of every human being, by creating circumstances that reveal whether someone has developed authentic wisdom or merely intellectual knowledge disguised as spiritual understanding. The testing isn't arbitrary punishment, but necessary separation that ensures those who have developed genuine spiritual maturity aren't corrupted by continued association with those who have chosen spiritual rebellion disguised as sophistication. Understanding this harvest prophecy reveals why periods of intense spiritual conflict serve divine purposes, even when they appear destructive from human perspectives. The same circumstances that elevate authentic spiritual development also expose and separate counterfeit spirituality, creating conditions where genuine communities of wisdom can emerge, while systems built on deception and spiritual compromise collapse under the weight of their own contradictions. The 48th dark secret involves the memory manipulation prophecy that describes how human consciousness and historical knowledge become systematically altered to prevent people from recognizing patterns, understanding their true spiritual heritage, or learning from previous generations who successfully navigated similar challenges. The warnings about forgotten wisdom, lost knowledge, and teachings that disappear from human memory weren't just concerns about natural cultural decline, but prophetic descriptions of deliberate consciousness manipulation designed to keep people spiritually ignorant and dependent. This memory warfare operates through educational systems that systematically exclude authentic historical knowledge, media programming that promotes false narratives about human potential and spiritual reality, and cultural conditioning that makes people ash heritage and disconnected of their spiritual from wisdom traditions, that could provide guidance during times of deception and crisis. The result is populations that lack the historical and spiritual context necessary for recognizing deceptive patterns or understanding their true identity and purpose. But the memory dimension reveals that authentic spiritual wisdom includes techniques for recovering suppressed knowledge and reconnecting with authentic spiritual heritage that transcends cultural programming and institutional manipulation. The wise person, described in Proverbs, possesses the ability to access knowledge and understanding that isn't available through conventional educational or cultural sources, but comes through direct spiritual connection to divine wisdom. The 49th dark secret involves the energy manipulation prophecy that describes how spiritual and physical energy systems become weaponized to either enhance or corrupt human consciousness and physical health. The references to life force, vital energy, and the power that flows through creation weren't primitive concepts about invisible forces, but sophisticated understanding of energy dynamics that would eventually be confirmed through advanced physics and consciousness research. The systematic corruption of natural energy fields through electromagnetic pollution, artificial frequency generation, and environmental toxification represents more than accidental byproducts of technological development. These energy manipulations appear designed to interfere with human consciousness development and spiritual sensitivity, while creating physical and mental conditions that make people more susceptible to external control and less capable of accessing authentic spiritual wisdom. Understanding this energy prophecy provides preparation for recognizing how environmental factors affect spiritual development and developing practices that protect and enhance natural energy systems despite systematic efforts to corrupt them. The wisdom literature contains encoded instruction for maintaining optimal energy balance and spiritual sensitivity, even in environments that have been deliberately compromised to interfere with authentic spiritual development. The 50th dark secret involves the identity theft prophecy that describes how authentic spiritual identity becomes systematically replaced with artificial identities designed to disconnect people from their true spiritual nature and divine purpose. The warnings about false names, stolen identities, and confusion about spiritual heritage weren't just concerns about individual deception, but prophetic descriptions of mass identity manipulation that would be used to control entire populations during the final stages of human civilization. This identity warfare operates through psychological programming that convinces people they are merely biological machines without spiritual significance, cultural conditioning that promotes artificial group identities based on external characteristics rather than spiritual reality, and educational systems that systematically destroy understanding of authentic human nature and divine purpose. The result is populations that don't know who they really are or why they exist, making them easy targets for manipulation and control. But the identity dimension reveals that authentic spiritual development involves recovering divine identity that transcends all artificial categories and cultural programming. The wise person described in Proverbs operates from understanding of their true spiritual nature and divine calling that can't be corrupted through external manipulation or social pressure, because it's based on direct relationship with divine reality rather than human opinions or institutional authority. The 51st dark secret involves the reality inversion prophecy that describes how truth and falsehood, good and evil, wisdom and foolishness become systematically inverted, so that authentic spiritual principles appear dangerous while destructive forces appear beneficial and attractive. The warnings about calling evil good and good evil weren't just moral teachings about individual choices, but prophetic descriptions of systematic reality inversion that would characterize entire civilizations during periods of maximum spiritual deception. This reality inversion operates through sophisticated psychological manipulation that gradually shifts collective perception so that populations begin to believe lies are truth, destruction is progress, and spiritual corruption is liberation. The process is so gradual and comprehensive that most people don't recognize it's happening until they find themselves living in societies where authentic spiritual wisdom is considered dangerous, while obvious spiritual deception is celebrated as advanced knowledge. Understanding this reality inversion prophecy provides preparation for maintaining clear spiritual perception despite systematic efforts to corrupt collective consciousness and individual discernment. The wisdom literature teaches techniques for distinguishing between authentic and counterfeit spiritual principles, regardless of how they're presented culturally or institutionally, enabling individuals to recognize truth even when entire societies have been deceived into accepting lies as reality. The 52nd dark secret involves the communion disruption prophecy that describes how authentic a spiritual community and divine relationship become systematically attacked through the promotion of artificial substitutes that appear spiritual but actually prevent genuine spiritual connection and development. The warnings about false fellowship, deceptive unity, and counterfeit spiritual community weren't just concerns about religious organizations, but prophetic descriptions of systematic community warfare designed to prevent authentic spiritual relationships from forming or surviving. This communion warfare operates through the promotion of artificial social connections that substitute emotional manipulation for genuine spiritual bond, institutional religious activities that replace authentic worship with performance and control, and communication technologies' illusion of connection while actually increasing that create the isolation and spiritual loneliness. The result is populations that hunger for authentic spiritual community, but can't recognize or create it because they've been conditioned to accept counterfeits as genuine. But the communion dimension reveals that authentic spiritual community operates according to principles that transcend institutional religious structures and can emerge wherever individuals possess genuine spiritual development and commitment to divine purposes. The wisdom literature contains instruction for recognizing and creating authentic spiritual relationships that serve mutual spiritual development rather than institutional control or personal manipulation. The 53rd dark secret involves the creative power prophecy that describes how human creative capabilities become either channels for divine wisdom and beauty or tools for spiritual deception and consciousness manipulation. The references to wise craftsmanship, inspired artistry, and creative works that reflect divine order weren't just appreciation for artistic skill, but prophetic descriptions of how creative expression would become a primary battlefield in the cosmic conflict between authentic and counterfeit spirituality. This creative warfare operates through the systematic corruption of artistic expression, entertainment media, and cultural production so that human creativity serves purposes of spiritual deception rather than truth, beauty, and genuine inspiration. The result is cultural environments that systematically promote spiritual confusion, moral corruption, and consciousness manipulation while presenting these destructive influences as artistic sophistication and creative freedom. Understanding this creative prophecy reveals that authentic spiritual development includes recovering divine creative capabilities that serve purposes of truth, beauty, and spiritual elevation, rather than deception and corruption. The wise person described in Proverbs possesses creative abilities that reflect divine wisdom and contribute to spiritual development in others rather than promoting confusion or moral compromise. The 54th dark secret involves the healing suppression prophecy that describes how authentic healing knowledge and practices become systematically suppressed, while artificial medical systems promote dependency and chronic illness disguised as healthcare advancement. The connections between spiritual condition and physical health that run throughout Proverbs weren't just ancient observations, but prophetic warnings about medical systems that would emerge to control rather than heal human populations. This healing warfare operates through the systematic suppression of natural healing methods, the promotion of pharmaceutical interventions that create dependency while suppressing symptoms rather than addressing root causes, and medical paradigms that deliberately ignore spiritual factors in health and disease. The result is populations that become increasingly sick and dependent on medical systems that profit from chronic illness rather than promoting genuine health and vitality. But the healing dimension reveals that authentic spiritual wisdom includes comprehensive understanding of natural healing principles that address spiritual, emotional, and physical aspects of human health in integrated approaches that promote genuine healing rather than symptom management. The wisdom literature contains encoded instruction for maintaining optimal health through proper spiritual development and natural living practices. The 55th dark secret involves the time distortion prophecy that describes how human perception of time and natural rhythms becomes systematically manipulated to interfere with spiritual development and authentic life patterns. The references to proper timing, natural seasons, and cosmic cycles weren't just practical advice about agricultural activities, but prophetic warnings about time manipulation technologies that would be used to disconnect people from natural rhythms and spiritual timing. This temporal warfare operates through artificial lighting systems that disrupt natural circadian rhythms, work and social schedules that prevent adequate rest and spiritual reflection, and entertainment and communication technologies that create addictive time distortion that prevents people from developing natural sensitivity to spiritual timing and cosmic cycles. Understanding this time prophecy provides preparation for maintaining natural time awareness and spiritual sensitivity, despite systematic efforts to create temporal confusion and disconnection from authentic life rhythms. The wisdom literature teaches principles for aligning with divine timing that transcends artificial scheduling and enables individuals to recognize and respond to spiritual opportunities and natural cycles. The 56th dark secret involves the inheritance theft prophecy that describes how authentic spiritual inheritance and divine promises become systematically stolen through legal, educational, and religious systems that convince people they don't possess or deserve their true spiritual heritage. The teachings about inheritance, spiritual legacy, and divine promises weren't just metaphorical language about salvation, but prophetic descriptions of systematic inheritance theft that would be used to keep people disconnected from their true spiritual identity and divine potential. This inheritance warfare operates through legal systems that criminalize or regulate authentic spiritual practices, educational institutions that teach people they are merely biological accidents without spiritual significance, and religious organizations that convince people their spiritual inheritance must be mediated through institutional authority rather than accessed directly through divine relationship. But the inheritance dimension reveals that authentic spiritual development involves claiming and activating divine inheritance that can't be stolen or regulated by human institutions because it operates through direct spiritual connection rather than external authorization or approval. The wise person described in Proverbs operates from understanding of their divine inheritance and calling that transcends all human systems of control and limitation. The 57th dark secret involves the frequency warfare prophecy that describes how sound, vibration, and electromagnetic frequencies become weaponized to either enhance or corrupt human consciousness and spiritual development. The connections between music, harmony, and spiritual condition weren't just poetic metaphors, but prophetic descriptions of frequency technologies that would be used to influence human consciousness on unprecedented scales. This frequency warfare operates through entertainment media that promotes frequencies designed to create emotional manipulation and spiritual confusion, communication technologies that emit electromagnetic radiation that interferes with natural brain function and spiritual sensitivity, and environmental pollution that includes frequency pollution designed to prevent optimal human consciousness development. Understanding this frequency prophecy provides preparation for recognizing how vibrational influences affect spiritual development and developing practices that promote harmonious frequencies while protecting against destructive vibrational influences. The wisdom literature contains encoded instruction for maintaining optimal vibrational health and spiritual sensitivity, despite systematic frequency warfare. These 57 dark secrets represent comprehensive hidden knowledge that reveals Proverbs as far more than ancient moral instruction. The text functions as prophetic preparation manual for navigating the most complex spiritual, technological, and consciousness challenges that would ever confront human civilization. Every teaching operates on multiple levels simultaneously, providing practical guidance for daily living while encoding advanced knowledge about spiritual warfare, consciousness development, and divine purposes that extend far beyond individual moral improvement. But recognizing these prophetic dimensions requires developing the spiritual discernment necessary to distinguish between surface-level interpretation and deeper meanings that emerge only through serious study, spiritual preparation, and genuine commitment to authentic spiritual development, rather than mere intellectual curiosity or religious entertainment. The most significant implication of these revelations isn't their historical or theological importance, but their immediate practical relevance for navigating contemporary challenges that appear to represent the culmination of prophetic patterns that have been building throughout human history. The same forces that ancient texts describe as opposing authentic spiritual development are now manifesting through technologies, institutions, and cultural systems that possess unprecedented power to influence human consciousness and behavior. Understanding the dark secrets hidden within Proverbs provides essential preparation for maintaining spiritual integrity, developing consciousness capabilities, and recognizing authentic wisdom during periods when the difference between truth and deception becomes the primary factor determining individual and collective destiny. The ancient wisdom preserved within these texts remains as relevant and practically applicable today as when it was first encoded within seemingly simple moral teachings. But accessing this transformative knowledge requires approaching biblical wisdom literature not as historical artifact or religious doctrine, but as living instruction for developing the spiritual maturity and consciousness capabilities that become increasingly essential as human civilization approaches its most challenging and potentially transformative period in recorded history. The question that emerges from these revelations isn't whether you believe in hidden knowledge or accept the possibility of prophetic information within ancient texts. The question is whether you possess the spiritual courage and moral development necessary to handle advanced wisdom responsibly, while using it constructively for divine purposes rather than allowing it to become a source of pride, manipulation, or spiritual deception. Because the same principles that can facilitate genuine spiritual development and consciousness evolution can also be corrupted into sophisticated tools for deception and control, when they're accessed by those who lack adequate spiritual preparation or moral foundation. The dark secrets hidden within Proverbs aren't dangerous because they're evil, but because they're powerful. And powerful knowledge always carries corresponding responsibilities that determine whether it serves constructive or destructive purposes. The journey into the hidden depths of biblical wisdom requires more than intellectual analysis or academic study. It demands spiritual transformation that aligns consciousness with divine purposes and develops the moral character necessary for handling advanced knowledge in ways that serve authentic spiritual development, rather than personal aggrandizement or the manipulation of others who lack similar understanding. The 58th dark secret involves the consciousness-splitting prophecy that describes how human awareness becomes systematically fractured into competing identities and conflicting belief systems that prevent authentic spiritual integration and divine relationship. The warnings about double-mindedness, divided hearts, and unstable thinking weren't just descriptions of individual psychological problems, but prophetic warnings about mass consciousness, fragmentation that would be used to control populations by keeping them internally conflicted and spiritually paralyzed. This consciousness warfare operates through media programming that deliberately promotes contradictory values and beliefs, educational systems that teach conflicting worldviews without providing frameworks for resolution, and social pressures that force people to maintain multiple incompatible identities in different contexts. The result is populations that can't develop stable spiritual foundations because their consciousness remains perpetually divided between competing loyalties and contradictory understandings of reality. But the integration dimension reveals that authentic spiritual wisdom provides methods for reunifying fragmented consciousness around divine truth that transcends all artificial divisions and conflicts. The wise person operates from integrated awareness that maintains consistency across all areas of life because their identity and values are anchored in spiritual reality rather than external circumstances or social expectations. The 59th dark secret involves the dependency creation prophecy that describes how authentic self-reliance and divine dependence become systematically replaced with artificial dependencies that serve systems of control rather than human flourishing. The teachings about diligent work, personal responsibility, and divine providence weren't just moral instructions about individual character, but prophetic warnings about systematic dependency creation that would be used to control entire populations through manufactured helplessness and artificial scarcity. This dependency warfare operates through economic systems that prevent genuine wealth creation while promoting consumption debt, educational institutions that discourage critical thinking and practical skills development, and social programs that create chronic dependence rather than temporary assistance towards self-sufficiency. The result is populations that become increasingly unable to care for themselves or their communities without institutional support and oversight. Understanding this dependency prophecy reveals that authentic spiritual development includes recovering practical capabilities and divine reliance that enable individuals and communities to flourish independently of systems designed to create control through manufactured dependence. The wisdom literature teaches principles for developing genuine security through proper relationship with divine provision and natural resources. The 61st dark secret involves the perception manipulation prophecy that describes how human sensory awareness and intuitive capabilities become systematically compromised through environmental toxification, electromagnetic interference, and chemical modification that prevents people from accurately perceiving spiritual realities or recognizing deception. The references to spiritual blindness, deafness, and numbness weren't just metaphorical descriptions of moral insensitivity, but prophetic warnings about systematic sensory warfare that would be used to prevent authentic spiritual perception. This perceptual warfare operates through food additives that interfere with neurological function, atmospheric pollution that affects brain chemistry and spiritual sensitivity, and pharmaceutical interventions that alter consciousness in ways that prevent authentic spiritual experience while creating artificial states that simulate spiritual awareness. The result is populations that lose the ability to distinguish between authentic and artificial spiritual experiences, or recognize when their consciousness is being externally manipulated. But the perception dimension reveals that authentic spiritual development includes techniques for protecting and enhancing natural perceptual capabilities despite systematic efforts to compromise them. The wise person maintains clear spiritual vision and accurate discernment that operates independently of external influences because it's grounded in direct divine connection rather than sensory information alone. The 62nd dark secret involves the legacy destruction prophecy that describes how authentic spiritual and cultural inheritance becomes systematically eliminated through the corruption of children, the destruction structures, and the replacement of family of natural generational wisdom transmission with institutional programming. The teachings about training children, honoring parents, and maintaining generational continuity weren't just family values instruction, but prophetic warnings about systematic legacy warfare designed to prevent authentic spiritual knowledge from being transmitted across generations. This legacy warfare operates through educational systems that deliberately undermine parental authority and family values, entertainment media that promotes dysfunction and rebellion as normal and desirable, and social policies that weaken family structures while strengthening institutional control over child development. The result is generations that remain spiritually immature and culturally disconnected, unable to learn from previous generations or transmit authentic wisdom to future ones. Understanding this legacy prophecy reveals that authentic spiritual communities must develop alternative methods for preserving and transmitting spiritual knowledge that can survive systematic efforts to disrupt natural family and community structures. The wisdom literature contains instruction for maintaining spiritual continuity across generations despite institutional interference with natural wisdom transmission patterns. The dark secrets hidden within Proverbs aren't just ancient mysteries waiting to be discovered. They're living instructions for navigating the most dangerous period in human history. Once you've seen what's really encoded within these pages, you can never return to comfortable ignorance. The same forces that ancient sages warned about are manifesting all around us today, and those who understand these hidden teachings possess knowledge that could determine their spiritual survival. What you do with this information will define not just your understanding of Scripture, but your ability to recognize truth in an age of unprecedented deception.